Good evening, Jeff.
Good evening, Ron.
How are you?
I'm doing quite well.
Um, Dana, prior to the show, said that she wanted some structure.
Yes, I
And
can't imagine why. The show is so well structured.
well, I mean, she decided that she wanted some structure, so we're going to go with that and dig in right away. One of the things she mentioned, she wanted to do introductions. Um, she mentioned axioms. So if she could quickly define the direction that she wants us to go into and what she would like to hear from each of us, that would be wonderful.
Well, Jeff's the one who really introduced me to the concept of axioms as your assumptions that you bring into your life and your worldview. And so, as a way of introduction, if I were to very concisely summarize me, I'm a stay-at-home mom of 8 children, and my axioms are uh, a close reading of the Bible. So basically, Christianity. How about you, Ron?
Um, so yes, I am not so much of what you are, obviously. My father. I work. I'm a normal, everyday person. I'm a pretty basic, everyday kind of person. I'm not unique, I don't think, in any particular way. As far as beliefs, what my side of things, many people would probably put me into the Christianity category. I would myself. Um, what that means, that's a lot of different things, obviously. So, but for the point of this discussion, I'm going to put myself in that category. And that's the category I would fit into.
Great. And tonight we have our first guest, who's also our first listener, the double distinctive Ned.
uh, so I don't know precisely the structure of this introduction, but I am a parental unit of some offspring, and I don't know if I have any claims on personal diversity and related to that context. As far as worldviews and or axioms, I've heard it said by some, maybe a fellow by the name of Jordan Peterson, that I'm too complex of a being to begin to understand my own axioms or primary worldviews. So perhaps I'm skeptical of understanding those things at a fundamental level. And I don't know if I would fit into any particular aforementioned categories, if that suits suitably well.
All righty. I guess I'll put away the box that I wanted to put on top of you then.
Maybe we'll circle back to that. I think you skipped somebody though.
Dana, did you want to introduce Jeff, or shall Jeff introduce Jeff?
My partner can introduce himself.
Oh, yes. So I am, yes, Dana's partner. And let's see, I also have the same amount of children, eight children. And let's see, I'm talking occupations for some reason, which isn't necessarily axioms, but I guess I'd be a teacher. secondary level teacher. My axioms, though, that I think of it as axioms or worldview, is probably mainly a theistic worldview, that there's some sort of God out there, and I specifically believe in the God described in the Bible. So I believe in that text as a way of creating a worldview. So that would be get down to my fundamental beliefs in summary. As for Neil, if I may chime in on your views, are you saying you don't have axioms or beliefs?
Are you referring to Ned?
Yeah, Ned, Jeff.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. There are a lot of names for the future guests that I know you're probably mixing Ned up with some other future guest.
It does say it on the screen here. I apologize. I am horrible with names, and that's not a lie.
That's all right. So, I mean, we could go down this rabbit hole if you want. No, I'm sure I have axioms, but sometimes people are aware of their axioms, and sometimes they're not.
Okay. Well, Dana or Ron or somebody, where are we going to go from here? So we've introduced ourselves. We got Dana, Jeff, Ron, and Ned.
Mm-hmm. Are you still there?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I have pretty choppy audio, so I'm just trying my best to hear what I can. But DJ Ron, the man, introduced this topic of diversity, and I have been carrying the conversation on at the park, at the beach. It's really been interesting. And one thing that came up in just a conversation I had yesterday was the idea of the backgrounds that we bring into this topic. And right now, I guess I'm focusing on the racial or ethnic diversity, the push for that in the workplace and in different places. And what's interesting, Ron, the man I talked to had a similar, something that you touched on last week, which was about when someone gets promoted, how there's this feeling or suspicion that it was because of their, ethnic group or like the diversity that they would bring, and not so much on their qualifications.
Right.
So, yeah, and it was interesting. So this man I talked to, he is a mixed race, I guess, if you'd call that, African American with a half black, half white. And his background was that he had grown up in a hippie commune in Hawaii, and his parents had actually fled Seattle in the 60s due to the racial discrimination and persecution they faced as a mixed race couple. And so Hawaii was not like that. It was more open to different people and relationships. But now, where his view on any type of push is that he just thinks it is going like way too far. He doesn't want to see someone promoted based on their skin color. And he had some, suspicions or resentments about someone who was just placed in management. And he feels it was due more to their color and gender rather than how qualified they were. So as a person who has experienced, very, very close to his own family, some intense discrimination, he still feels like where we are today is going too far and it's unnecessary. So I thought that was actually really interesting to hear from him.
No, that's good stuff. And you will not only hear it from him, you'll hear it from a lot of people in his situation or very close to his situation.
Yeah, and so that, as I thought more too about why I mostly have not felt when I've heard in the media how we need, the different voices and we need to have more representative sample of the ethnic groups, to I guess to a more precise proportional amount. Does that make sense? And how I just have felt not like as enthused or like excited about the idea. And I thought about my own growing up and upbringing. Like I had just so much diversity around me. My friends were diverse. I had Mexican, white, African American friends. My parents I never once heard them say a racial slur against any group. It was only later that my mom, I'd hear her make jokes about, white people parties or whatever. And it's in a more, I don't know how to define that. We were talking about jokes last time, but that's like a more goodwill. I don't think she really has these grudges or whatever. But my parents were open to me having a diverse friends. And even in high school, it's so funny. Like the friends I had, we almost looked like one of those very purposeful ads where like every ethnic group is represented practically. Like there were a few white girls, 2 Mexicans, 1 Filipino, and 1 mixed race African American, and 1 Native American. Even it was just silly. Like so as far as colors, I was always surrounded by that with my own intimate circle in my school and then in the places I've lived. And so on one hand, though, I recognize that it's not like that everywhere. I didn't grow up in a really isolated small town or something where maybe things were less mixed. So perhaps that's what I'm bringing to when I listen to all the dialogues on, like, I guess in the media, just because to me it's been so normal, even though I know there's racial tensions and not everything's been perfect. Just growing up, I did not have a highly segregated experience. And it wasn't until later, too, that I heard some of my family members who would say, they wouldn't let their daughters date an African American. But that was really later. I guess growing up when I was young, diversity was very normal to me.
In a weird way, you've almost got a limited experience because you are in an overly diverse sort of experience, whereas others seem to share things with you that describe the opposite. You spoke of another friend that you had who was somewhere in the United States where the fact that she had brown hair was a problem. Can you share that one?
Yes. So that's why, Ron brought up this topic, and I just started asking people, at wherever I was at, they thought, and that North Dakota, she's from Eastern Europe, and because she had brown hair, she does remember a playmate not being allowed to be friends with her because she might be one of those Indians. So that's different. Right? I never had that type of experience. Like, so she would so she was bringing up how it's not like, well, where we are, so Southern California, very diverse. It's not like that everywhere in the country. And even today, I mean, obviously when that happened to her, it was like 30 years ago. So I think a lot's changed in 30 years. Maybe that same family wouldn't say the same thing to their children, or that same girl, she probably has children now. She probably wouldn't carry that on. I think a lot of people have it's really faded. So yeah, when Ron brought up the topic, I thought, oh, diversity has been very normal to me. And but Jeff, you had a different background, right? Where even though you grew up in the same area, you had seen things a lot different.
Yeah, we were within probably a 5-mile radius of each other. And I did have a different experience because I think I grew up in a racist home. And when I say racist, it's not Ku Klux Klan kind of racist, but there was an underlying racism and at times overt racism, ranging from jokes to when there was an interracial relationship within my family, parents talking with one of the children and expressly telling them that they shouldn't be in this relationship because of the color of the skin of the other person. That's overt racism. And so I had an experience growing up where racism was sort of an underlying theme to the point where when I had a friend in middle school, I still remember one day I realized that she was, quote, black, unquote. And I realized, oh my gosh, she's one of those people. I never realized I shouldn't be friends with her, because I didn't realize that as I was raised, the term black, I didn't really even know what it meant. It was just there was black people and there was white people, and I didn't really understand what a black person even was, even though I had all these sort of ideas in my head that were thrown at me and became part of the way I viewed the world. I didn't even realize that when I had a friend who had dark skin, that that person was a black person, and then at some point I had to process, oh shoot, I probably shouldn't be friends with them. So that was the world I grew up in. It was an underlying racism kind of thing.
Well, I guess what we need to be able to do is, be able to define or explain why diversity is so important.
Okay, I'd like to take a crack at it.
Okay.
So, as I was mentioning earlier, when I was listening to the podcast, I felt like there was a lot of kind of mentions of the term diversity that I got a little confused by, because I felt like there were several different meanings being tossed around, even in the same, all at the same time, where I wasn't sure kind of what the actual topic was. So if we're talking about just if we're talking about diversity in the context of just not discriminating, so for instance, being able to get a mortgage loan, or being able to get employment, or being able to run for office, or being able to get a tenure position at a university, those kinds of things. I think that the word diversity comes up in the context that in our very recent history, within our lifetimes, and certainly within the lifetimes of our parents, our society had systems in place, not just accidental, some of it accidental, but some of it very purposeful, to make barriers of entry to certain groups to opportunity and to positions of power. And so in efforts to try to correct for that, there were legislative steps taken to try to not discriminate, and then go even beyond that with things like affirmative action that were seen as just a natural conclusion to not discriminating. And so obviously it's a very controversial topic, but it's happening in a context of people trying to make sure that the power sharing is representative of the diversity of the population of the country. Because for a long time, and even now, you'll see in the federal Congress, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and even here in the state of California, I'm assuming you're in California, the Senate and the House of Representatives is not actually a reflection of the population of either our nation or the state. Now, we could just say that, well, that's just a matter of natural inclination. It's just a matter of the hustle that people have, or the hard work that people put in, or it's just a matter of the people that are who want to do that, and it's not anything to do with barriers to entry. It's just a matter of, well, these are the people that showed up and wanted to make something happen. And there's no way to fix that, right? There's no way to fix just natural go-to know-how and motivation. and we shouldn't try because otherwise we're messing things up. But I think the people who are interested in diversity are saying, no, it's not a matter of natural inclination or gumption or know-how or just stick-to-itiveness. It's a matter of barriers to entry. And we need to find a way to, yes, what Dana said, provide equal opportunity, not, and one of the ways we can try to see if we're creating equal opportunity is if it eventually leads to outcomes that is a reflection of equal power sharing, as it were. Because if there's a Senate and a House of Representatives in the state who are passing laws that concern constituents that are not represented proportionally, then it can lead to legislation that is underinformed or just naturally favors the worldview and viewpoints of the majority that holds those positions of power. So I think that generally the motivation isn't just this kind of airy-fairy idea that, well, we just need to have the Noah's Ark collection of two black gay women and 5 Hispanic people and 2 white guys. It's the idea that, well, if we look at the state of California, I don't know what it is right now. I'm just going to make a wild stab. 45 to 55% of the residents here are of Hispanic descent. Therefore, if we don't see that reflected in our state Senate and our state House of Representatives, maybe there's an issue as far as barriers to entry. And we might end up passing laws that are not ultimately sustainable or good for our state because it's not representative of the population that lives here. That we don't want to end up in a situation like there was in South Africa, where there's this very small minority of people who are holding all the reins of power and are wielding it over a majority of the population. I think that's what, I don't know for sure, but I think that's what people are kind of aiming at, or a lot of times what they're very concerned about when they talk about diversity. Then there is the further, like the things that go even further, where you have to make sure that on your bookshelf you don't just have overwhelmingly dead white European males, that you should also fill your bookshelf with female voices and African authors and authors from Malaysia. I'm assuming there are people who are saying this, but I think that's a minority of the voices that are concerned with diversity, and that maybe it is important, and maybe that's a value for some people, but that could be used as a straw man to kind of poke at diversity without actually kind of starting to worry about, are we proportionally represented in positions of power, or are there barriers to entry for women to hold CEO positions? Not just that women aren't inclined toward those positions, or maybe they just self-select out because they want to have babies, but maybe there is a sufficient number of women that do want CEO positions, or maybe we should have at least half, if not more than half, of the Supreme Court to be women, since over half the population of the country is female. I think those are
So should we condemn a Supreme Court justice saying that essentially it should be filled with women?
I don't know if we should condemn that. I think that we should take her words in context, or maybe give the most charitable interpretation. So the most charitable interpretation I would have given it is that she's trying to highlight our our default thinking, that our default is, for a long time, white male is the default, and anything else is maybe the diversity box. And that, you know, that maybe Justice Kagan, for instance, maybe she got nominated to the Supreme Court because Obama just wanted to just check the Hispanic female box, you know, and that she's underqualified, but so that's why that I think that thought comes in to our brains because we think of white males as the default. No one thought Merrick Garland was nominated because he's a white dude. You know, we didn't think that because that's the default. Of course, it was obviously because he's probably qualified and is liberal, but has some sufficient conservative credentials that the conservative establishment probably won't object if it goes to a vote. That's what people were talking about, right?
Yeah, and
I think it's a valid observation that you're talking about, but I don't know that it takes us anywhere. And this is what I mean. It's a valid observation that people have that knee-jerk reaction when they hear a female, Hispanic female, and then they may not have that same reaction when they hear about whoever the guy is that is currently gonna be doing this. And so I think there's validity to the observation that there's something going on with that knee-jerk reaction, but I don't know what else to do with it.
It was just in response to Ron's question. So Ron was, I think, trying to say, well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is being overly inflammatory by saying, well, we should have 9 women justices. But we probably wouldn't think of it as overly inflammatory if someone said, well, we should just have all men on the Supreme Court.
No, I know what you're saying, and I think it's a interesting and provocative thought, but it doesn't really lead us down to anything.
Oh, so it was an explanation. It was a possible explanation for why she might say that, not as a path to lead to greater understanding, but just understanding that no, I guess I don't think she should be condemned for saying that if we understand the context in which she's saying it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of having 9 Supreme Court women again as thought experiments and to help us question our natural flow of thought and those kind of things. What I'm trying to say is I don't know where it gets us to. I do have a question for you. You said some interesting things, and there's a couple things, but there's one in particular that I find very interesting. And within what you said, it almost sounded like, or actually, it didn't almost sound like. You basically seemed to say something that I wanted to ask about, and that is, do you think that since I'm European, poorly pigmented, what people would, many people would call me white, although I have problems with that strange term.
You should.
Do you think that from your words that I wouldn't be able to make good policy for Dana, who would fit the category of female and medium pigmentation? She would be Latina. So you seem to say that,
Latinx.
So do you from what you said, you talked about the quantities of people within the positions as it relates to the populations and the policies they would make as it relates to worldviews. Ultimately, it sounds like you're suggesting. So are you saying I can't make good policy because I'm European and male? If for someone who's Hispanic like Dana?
I would not say that.
Okay, would you say that? Because you did say earlier something that I didn't expect you to say, that I couldn't. Now here comes the next question. But do you feel like I could make some mistakes in things? Is that what you're saying, or that I'm going to overlook things because of who I am?
That's a better question. So I would say that it's a hazard. That it's a potential hazard. Yeah. So that one of the things that I find interesting is that it seems to me what I hear a lot from when I talk to my libertarian friends, one of the things that I hear them say a lot is that you should let local government decide at local levels, the vast majority of kind of legislative issues, because local government knows what's best for their locality, that kind of sentiment, right? And I don't know if I don't know if you share any of those sentiments or if you have any of those proclivities, but
I
the
do.
idea being, yeah. So the idea being that that local government should really be the primary thing, and that we should try to resist mightily any over interference from the federal types that are just reigning from some ivory tower and trying to tell local populations what they do or don't want, or what's best for them, in a kind of misguided paternalistic venture, right? So so I think libertarians could be very sensitive to that issue. So along that same kind of worry, where maybe the population being legislated to doesn't get perhaps as full a say as they want in the legislation that's being passed. It's a hazard. It's a potential hazard, and I think libertarians can understand it in the federal versus local context. In the same way, maybe we can use that as an analogy to say it might be a hazard if our bodies of government are not representative of the ethnic and cultural and gender backgrounds and percentages of the population that they're legislating to. It's not that white dudes can't make good legislation for Latina female populations, but that there's, I think, a greater hazard that they may not legislate as well if there isn't a commensurate voice of Latina females participating directly in that legislative process within the government body that's making the legislation.
Hey, Neil.
Yeah. Just one follow-up, Ron, and then.
Okay.
And you would say, just looking at the skin color and gender, knowing nothing about these people's backgrounds, worldviews,
IQs.
IQ, shoe size, like you just. So when you say hazard, are you talking like a loose hazard, as in it's not really a hazard, or do you mean it is really hazardous? So are you saying in your mind there's this greater possibility that they're not going to do as good a job, simply based on the color of their skin and their gender, knowing nothing else about them?
So I sense this under this subtext here that you feel this is a skin deep understanding of the hazards, or that this is an overly simplistic way of thinking, and I'm not sure precisely how to respond. The question seems to already have the answer inside it, so maybe I can reframe the question. I mean, if you're asking me, I'm not even sure exactly how to.
I don't think I need to reframe it. I'm being very clear. You can read my subtext, or you can look at my exact text. The question is, do you look at the numbers and you see male and white, and that's it, without knowing anything about these people? You don't know their culture, their worldview. You know nothing about them, and you're already saying it's a hazard. Are you saying a potential hazard, or are you saying actual hazard? It's actually hazardous.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying it's a potential hazard. I don't know. I mean, and that if we look at maybe historical data, that it might bear out that if you actually only look at those data points, that it might turn out to be that it's in fact hazardous. But I don't know for sure. I guess I would have to.
You're just saying it might be, though. It
I
is.
think
It is a hazard, or it might be a hazard.
I think there's definitely a potential for hazard there, and that currently, the way that government seems to be not quite representative of populations, based on these kind of shallow markers that we maybe pay too much attention to. That there are some not so great outcomes, and that maybe it's not even sustainable under its current conditions.
Can you give me one example of a white male outcome recently that you think comes from your ideas that you just gave?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, maybe. So, and I might be a little. Well, I was saying actually more back to the Supreme Court. So, I think potentially I think it was the Hobby Lobby case where the company, it was decided by the Supreme Court the company could not provide birth control based on basically a religious on religious grounds.
And you believe that was because they were white males?
I think that could potentially have been made ultimately because of the gender of the gender makeup, the gender percentage of the current Supreme Court.
What do you think if there was nine
It's possible. It's possible that
females? Do you think that having 9 Hispanic females that were Danas up there would maybe sway it towards the other way?
It's possible. I mean, so
no. Think about me, Neil. Think about who I am.
You gotta think about who Neil is.
9 Danas.
I mean,
just give me 1 second. So it's certainly possible that the gender makeup of the current Supreme Court really didn't affect or had no true impact on that particular decision or that particular case, and that it wasn't really about gender at all.
Well, let's throw it out there. I want a good example. Give me a good example, because you said a lot, and I'm saying I would like to. You would hope that you'd have at least one example of the male, because you talked specifically about California. So the white male lawmakers made which law that bothered you because they were white males?
I'm generally really bad at coming up with examples on the spot.
Well, you should have at least one, because you believe this is the problem. You're actually saying that.
Yeah,
I'm saying that white males are out of proportion with the population within California, and it's hazardous to the point that they're going to disenfranchise their Latino and female constituents. And I'm just saying, okay, I think I understand your perspective. Can you give me one example of where this occurred in California? That's what you were talking about.
So let me clarify a little bit. So when I mentioned that, I was giving that as an example of what I think people are worrying about when they talk about diversity. That's the concern that is on their minds. I wasn't making a claim that this is in fact definitely happening in California. Now, if you asked me, do I think this is definitely in fact happening in California, I would probably say yes. But my original statement was more carefully worded than what you're representing it as. But if you were to ask me right now, give you an example, I don't know if I can come up with one off the top of my head. Now, you're saying that if I believe this, certainly I would have had an example at some point, or come across one to hazard such a notion. And I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that I have read something, and that given a little bit of time, next week perhaps, or sometime this week, I could probably find something for you. But just off the top of my head, I don't think I'm going to come up with a good example.
Ned.
Yeah.
Let me ask the question a different way that might help you be
Sure.
able to articulate an answer.
Sure.
What problems do you see that are unique to white males in which they have caused?
Let me see if I understand the question. So I think what you're asking is,
what problems when white males are involved, right? What is unique to that situation that doesn't exist in other places? So for instance, do you see where I'm going?
I think I do. So so if I understand correctly, and tell me if I'm wrong, you're saying why are white males basically the villains of this story? What is it about white males in particular that is singled out for pernicious slander as far as the soldiers of diversity?
I mean, tell us about this hazardous stuff.
Yeah, the soldiers of diversity and the social justice warriors. Why do white males get to be the villains? So what I think the answer is, as far as those who cry the loudest, is that right now, and I could be wrong about this again. But I think the understanding or the context is, when I talk to people who definitely hold diversity as a value, is that they would say that right now we live in a context in this country that has a history that has brought about a system that collectively thinks of white males as the default, as kind of the vanilla option, if you'll permit that pun, that is what is the standard by which everything else gets measured, and that that white male is overwhelmingly the demographic of those who hold the most positions of power, whether it's CEOs of companies or people who are making policy in government, or who hold, who are the heads of, governmental institutions that make the rules. And so it's not anything in particular about white males. I mean, white males could be a persecuted minority over in Uganda, but that in this context, that white males, because of this particular context of our country and the kind of societal makeup that we have now, that white males have a particular experience that makes them possibly insensitive to particular types of issues. I hear most often from my white male friends that, sex discrimination, that doesn't happen, or racism is a thing of the past. We don't have racism in this country right now because I don't see it. And if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. And I'm not saying that that's what you do, or I'm not saying that that's everyone. All I'm saying is that when I talk to people who say racism doesn't exist in this country anymore, it has 100% match with people who are generally white. My mic is about to die. It's on a battery. Oh, maybe I can plug it in. Just give me 1 second.
Well, I think what would be important is if we drill down into, though, the problems
Okay,
that-
sorry.
Okay.
If anything was said, I didn't hear it. I had to plug my mic in.
Okay.
But,
So
what happened?
I'm gonna restate. I didn't
Yeah.
get to
Wait,
completely
I have something.
finish.
I have something. I have to interrupt you, Ron.
Oh,
Ned,
Yes.
just something funny.
Yes.
My partner
Yes.
recently was
Ah. So yes. So
was
a
re-
counterexample. Perfect.
yes was recently I tell me if I'm wrong, partner Dana, was recently asking me if racism was a problem.
Yes.
Now she happens to be female, and
Yes. Totally true. Yeah. Well, I didn't include male in that
I
one.
had to explain to her, oddly enough, just to further counterexample, I had to explain to her that yes, racism does exist, and I gave her many examples because
Yeah.
as a teacher, I have to deal with racism.
Yeah.
I won't say on a daily basis,
Yeah.
but I will say that you could. It'd be interesting to chart it out how often it is. It's pretty common that that racism exists at some level on my
Yeah.
campus.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit ironic because I'm the
Yeah.
so-called white guy and she's the
Yeah.
so-called brown girl. And Dana,
Yeah.
weren't you having this conversation, or am I making this up?
I don't think I'd ever say that it wasn't an issue. So maybe it was the extent of how it would hinder things.
No, you were talking about, is racism still a problem? You were asking me.
Is racism? I don't know if I would have asked it that simply though. There was some context to it. But sure, no, Jeff was more more aggressively defending the idea. And what's interesting is it might have a little bit to do with like what he told me in that answer was people will feel like it's safe to tell racist jokes to him, like mean racist jokes, like not like the taco one that we were talking about, like talking about those people to him because he's white. And they don't do that to me. Except, well, again, I've had a little bit of that, but I think Jeff gets that a lot more because people will assume he's okay with talking like that, and so, so that was very interesting.
So definitely a potential counterexample, and certainly my anecdotal evidence is even low in my own opinion.
But Ron, you have something to say, and I want you to say it. But it is interesting. I have to rant a little bit about race, just briefly. I could rant longer, but I'll try to keep it brief. Regarding my own opinion of racism, I do see racism quite often as a teacher. I have students insulting other students by saying you're from Africa, and the insinuation is that they're dumb. They don't say you're from Europe or you're from Spain. You're from South America. They say you're from Africa. Students still are very racist towards richly pigmented, as most people say, black, right? Very racist in that regard. And it does occur. And what my wife was talking about is something that occurs to me periodically, but it does consistently occur. People feel that since based on the color of my skin that I must be holding racist views, and they will share openly with me racist jokes. They'll say racist things. I'm talking teachers at high school. I'm thinking of two specifically, not all of them, but just two specifically in my mind. And recently another person came up and shared it, like a racist conspiracy theory about leadership, from which later they tried to say why they felt it was the case, because I kind of started to say I thought that was racist and they tried to justify it. But here's the thing. I firmly believe that Dana nor others of darker skin color will get such freedom of racist information delivered to them on a platter. And I think that that is part of the so-called, over on here it comes, white privilege, is that people actually think of me as a safe place simply because of the color of my skin, and will be racist in my midst. And that is something I do experience. So does racism exist? Yes. Does systemic racism exist within the written policies currently? I think we've done a pretty good job as a country of eliminating any outright written policy-based racism out of the system.
Yeah.
Did it exist 50 years? Neil pointed out this well a moment ago. I mean, it used to be in housing. It used to be everywhere, and that was just 50 years ago. But thankfully, at least on paper, the paper trail of it all, that's illegal basically now and gone away, as far as I know.
Can I?
So
Sorry.
that's all. I know that was a little bit of a rant, and I know Ron, hopefully you held your thought. But I absolutely do think racism exists. It is definitely not the same as it used to be, where there were systemic in the written laws racism, and it was accepted, and people more commonly thought there was them and those people. They would actually say those people, and I'm friends with one of those people. They had these us and them ideas. A lot of that is dissipating, but still there's this racist stuff, and I can't help but expect that affects people with dark skin on a daily basis.
Can I add though, Jeff, and even try Ron's patience more, just to add context in your school? It's not the white kids who are saying, "Go, you're from Africa." This is the Hispanic students, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody
you,
in
Dana.
media,
Thank you.
nobody in media
Thank
would
you,
ever
Dana.
say like something with what Neil said, like, "Oh, there's a risk for white males to neglect or whatever, by omission or whatever the needs of population." But nobody talks about, oh, well, what if we elect a Hispanic governor? He might be, racist against the needs of the African Americans, because we know how bad the racial tensions are. So that's something that I think is problematic. Too. And again, in my own family, I've seen that, it's Hispanics who have said in the past they wouldn't let their child date an African American.
Yeah,
but I think the white male becomes the ultimate supervillain in the discussion.
But
that's crazy.
So just to respond a little bit to that, and we can go down this rabbit trail if you like or not. I think that I never hear that discussed in conservative media, but I certainly hear that issue discussed in kind of left-leaning media a lot more. So I don't know if that's an exposure issue or not. But there is a distinction made in certain circles, maybe still mostly academic, making a distinction between what some would label as racist and some would label as racialist. And this might seem like a nonsensical, silly distinction, especially if you're coming from an assumption that systemic racism is basically a thing of the past. If it's not in our current context, then this distinction will make zero sense. But the distinction that's made is that something is racist if it falls along the discriminatory lines that are currently in place in a systematic way in our country, and not just according to legislation, but how our society kind of organizes itself in the unofficial way around social norms and legislation. And it's racialist if it's discrimination of certain minority groups to other certain minority groups, or even to their own minority group, so that it falls along the lines of discrimination, maybe from those who don't hold power to other groups that don't hold very much power in our current context, but that don't fall along the lines of the systemic racism that people believe is there. So there is a distinction there. So that some make that maybe you disagree with.
Well,
so what Jeff would be describing, according to certain academic circles, is racialism and not necessarily always racist. Just to introduce that
real quick.
Introduce that term. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, and Ron,
I'm here.
I think He has a story
Please.
picked on because of the color of his skin as a young age, at a
Oh,
young age, and so I
yeah.
think you're saying that would be racialist because those definitions, because he was picked on even though he was in statistically. Am I getting that right? He based on the color of his skin. If
Yes.
he's picked on, it's called race. You're
Possibly,
saying?
yeah.
Well,
Uh,
I'm gonna stop here
sure.
real quick because we really need to tackle this
Sorry,
question.
I apologize. That was a big rabbit trail. Ron,
No,
you go.
no,
You
no,
go.
no. It's
Boy.
not a rabbit trail, and Dana thankfully pointed out something very important, as she often does. But that is, she pointed out something, and this goes to my question. Tell me the problem, point out the problems that exist unique to white males being in positions of authority.
Yeah, so white males being in positions of authority are fine. I think that what people who are particularly concerned about diversity and use that term as a rallying cry are concerned about is that there's a disproportionate amount of white males who hold positions of authority and who may be, statistically speaking, insensitive to the um, the particular needs of people who are not white or who are not male, and so they perhaps can't speak to that experience or understand what the particular needs are. It goes back to that analogy of the libertarian worry about federal government dictating to local populations where local government would do much better, kind of idea. So it's not that white males are inherently evil or that they're bad or that them holding positions of power is a problem. The issue is, you know, proportional representation. People who can understand the context and the needs and the desires of particular cultural, ethnic, or gender backgrounds. That's the. I don't know if that makes any sense. But that's
No.
what I think I understand that people are talking about when they are bringing up diversity as a concern.
Well, yeah, and I get what you're saying. My question again is, what is the exact problems though that exist unique to white males being in power? What can you point to? And here,
It's the
let me
okay.
go this way. Let me go this way.
Okay.
You're probably well aware, as most people are, the conditions in Mexico, right?
Perhaps, but what's the specific thing that we're
Corruption,
like governmental
discrimination.
corruption? Okay.
Yeah, discrimination, all the same things that exist here,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
largely, as far as I know, there's not a large portion of white males running that country.
Okay.
So again, what are the specific issues that white males cause that are unique to white males being in authority?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to answer again, and hopefully I'll be more clear. It's not white males in particular. It's white males in this particular context, where white males experience an amount of privilege that not everyone does, and are not necessarily representative of the population in which they are holding that position of authority. So it's not white males as far as like there's a gene or there's some kind of inherent issue on some spiritual level or any of those things. So
So the hazard.
I can't think of a particular counterexample to put it in a different context. But as you pointed out, in Mexico, there's huge problems with corruption, which really are kind of, well, largely the fault of the United States. But we don't have to go into that. But
probably the white males in the United States. I'm
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
They're
Probably,
actually the problem in Mexico.
Probably. If we want to
You
go
guys
down
are
that someday.
powerful.
I know,
You guys have a
right?
powerful reach.
Yeah. Well,
Better watch out.
It goes back to guns, germs, and steel.
Ned.
Yeah.
So the hazard really is within the context of the narrative of we need diversity. White males dominate that venue, and therefore it's important to spread power, right? Is that because if that's the case, that's fine. That's saying, hey, we want in our club more women on our seats, and we want more Mexicans represented. We want more Chinese represented, whatever, Asians. So that's kind of the issue. Is that the thing here?
That's my understanding of what the primary concern is. That's kind of at the top of the list, as far as I understand it.
Okay. So, but I think day to day and how it actually affects people's lives, there's nothing unique. There's no problem that exists here that doesn't exist in other places. So, for example, women not having access to birth control. That's not a problem unique to white males in the United States. That's probably an issue all over the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. I think that every country kind of has its own challenges as far as, power sharing and issues of racism and discrimination and those kinds of things. Absolutely. And I think some countries have maybe solved some of those issues a little more than others. But
well,
yeah,
so have we. So we've overcome a lot of those barriers. I mean,
yeah, Brown versus Board was a good decision, right? I mean, there's definitely been good things that have happened in taking steps to mitigate racism. But I'm definitely on Jeff's side when he says that racism is still very much an issue in our country, and that it does affect people on a daily basis. And it's not just so it's whether it's racism or racialism, right?
What a crime! What a crime to share a joke that's actually probably pretty funny that points out some unique characteristics about a certain ethnicity. So for example, last week we talked about calling somebody beaner, right? Dana's friend. I had many friends say that over the years, including many Mexican friends, and mostly would come from my Hispanic or Mexican friends. Those kind of jokes. I mean, those were equally shared in many circles. It wasn't just an exchange between white people. I had those same exchanges with African Americans. I had those same exchanges with Asians. I had those same exchanges with Mexicans. I mean, you name it. Those that's not unique to whites. And this idea that Jeff has that racism exists, again, I'm going to go and say, well, point to these situations that are unique. If Jeff wants to say that racism exists and it's a problem for everybody, and all races are equally guilty, and I think, okay, yeah, that's a fair assessment. If you want to if you want to categorize jokes as racism, that exists equally in all areas of life. And it is not unique. It is not unique to white people.
Okay,
Well,
It's not
so here's
unique to African Americans. It's not unique to Mexicans.
okay.
It's not unique to Asians.
real quick, just to be clear, racism, racialism, whatever you want to call it, I'm simply acknowledging the existence of and the experience of it myself, and also the obvious listening to others, their experience, and even just projecting the what's happening to me must be negatively happening to others. And so I'm just saying it exists. However, saying something exists and discussing policy again, and discussing whether someone can um, obtain employment and purchase a house and get into a position of power within government, all of those other things is different than accepting the fact that racism is still in existence. I hope that's clear if I'm not being
Okay.
clear. So
No, I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, it sounds like we're not totally on the same page about that, but I do appreciate that. So Ron said basically, okay, people can be overly sensitive, and just because someone tells a joke that may be considered racist doesn't mean that there's anyone harmed in the making of this film, or that this should be a concern that should consume much of our time, or that we should still be talking about diversity because people maybe make funny jokes that some people are overly sensitive to. If I'm getting that wrong, please let me know. And furthermore, that it can be accepted that racism is an issue if we accept that it's equally a problem across all people groups, however we want to kind of make these largely sometimes imaginary divisions that aren't necessarily matched up with DNA haplogroups and that kind of thing. I mean, most of the time when people talk about race, they're talking about cultural groupings, not necessarily genetic makeup. But which is another kind of, in a sense, under support of actually a kind of a racist way of thinking. But I think that what is unique in this country is not that white males or white people in particular have a corner on the market of thinking discriminatory or problematic thoughts about people they perceive as other or not part of their group per se, or not necessarily similar to them in ethnic or what they think of as genetic background. Of course not, right? Of course not. But what is, I think, unique, and what I think is kind of hard, it seems, for some of us to think about in a particular way, is that what is different is that when a particular people group, or what's perceived as a people group of white, which I think Jeff also has a very valid, I hope, criticism of even that term white. I have a problem with it too. I think it's totally an invented term and totally an invented group.
Red, brown, yellow, black, and white. It's
Yeah, it's horrible and it's nonsense. But so what is unique about what that perceived group, what's different is that overwhelmingly they are in power in this country, and so maybe they're not the only ones who think discriminatory thoughts or might discriminate either just in their brains or in action against what they might perceive as other, but that they also happen to be overwhelmingly in the positions of power in this country. And so that's what currently makes the difference as far as what people make that distinction about what racism is versus what racialism is.
So it's fair to say that the only problem that really exists with white males being overrepresented in authority is the fact that they're overrepresented. So in other words, the only problem we need to solve is just get more diversity in these roles. And that's the only problem it's going to solve, correct? I mean, because all the problems that really exist, that are real problems, those are all still going to be there, right? I mean, once the playing field is leveled and white males are taken out of power, right? I mean, all those same problems are going to exist, right? Because again, as we've noted, there's nothing unique that exists with white males being an authority, right?
Yeah, so it could be this. It's an unsolvable problem, right? It could be that no matter what we do, there's always going to be it's always going to be unrepresentative, or someone is going to be discriminated against, or someone's going to be disenfranchised, right? And this is one of the interesting things to me. I'll grant that it's possible that's the case, and it's just an intractable problem. So why should we even worry about it, right? I mean, it's just no matter who's in power or who's going to kind of take the reins, that we're always going to end up with the same problems of someone being disenfranchised.
Yeah, that's true, though, right? I mean,
I don't know if it is. I don't know if it is. I mean, maybe it is, or maybe it's not. But let's just set that question aside for just a second.
Show me a place where it's not, and then we'll
okay.
say yes, there is that possibility. But in reality, there are no places that these problems don't exist. So saying that we can't come up with a fictional a utopia kind of situation. We have to be able to point to it and go, here is a place where these problems that we don't like, they don't exist, and they don't exist because white males aren't in authority.
So wouldn't you say that? Sorry.
So before 1850, there were also no places that had solved air flight, or measles, But vaccines were kind of a fictional solution to ending, huge amount of death that was totally unnecessary. So, I mean, just because we can't necessarily point to a place where it's already happened doesn't mean it's not possible, right? I mean, it could be that I'm imagining a utopia. It could be that this is an unsolvable problem. That's certainly possible. But to kind of say, well, then, what we have is good enough, and we shouldn't try to aim at utopia because it's just going to cause problems. I'm not sure I can get buy-in for that one. But if we just set that question aside for just a second, one of the things that I feel like is kind of, when I hear people talk about this, what I feel like is underlying this is that there's this kind of fear that basically historically what's happened in this country, seemingly done by kind of overwhelmingly what's perceived as a particular group, largely white males in positions of power, right? There's this fear that the tables are going to be turned, right? And that what was kind of perpetuated by one group is now going to be perpetuated upon that group. And I find that just really, I just find that fascinating. I don't
know if anyone's saying that here, unless I'm misreading you. I don't know that anyone's suggesting that. I do think it's interesting that I'm thinking about what Ron's saying, and I feel like I understand what I might understand what he's saying. Like, for example, if you go to North Korea, it's probably a good example. North Korea, the ethnicity of the leadership seems to match the ethnicity of the population. So we don't have to worry about the leadership having these same issues that we have.
But that's
what?
But there's also no ideals there of being representative. I mean, they don't care about being representative or not. So I don't know why it's not a point of comparison really, because there's no. So here in this country, we had this idea.
Go ahead. No. He is correct. Yes, he is
just saying, so then if we go to China, and then we look at the ethnicities of the leadership, you're saying that it's going to be better if you look at the population of the Chinese and you look at the ethnicities and you look at the leadership. If it's the same, if the leadership we need to have the leadership's ethnicity proportion has to match the population ethnicity portion for ideal government. That's the idea here.
So do you feel that in China that's the case?
Well, I'm saying.
I mean, right now, is the government of China, is it proportional to the population as far as being representative?
It's a good question. I would have to go check.
I would say definitively it's not.
Are you saying
that the ethnicity of the population of China is definitely not represented by those who are in power, especially at the very top? Like, not even close.
Well, what's funny about what you're saying right now is you're probably not calling everybody in that area Asian. And what I'm thinking is kind of interesting is because we break it down so superficially that would be unacceptable what you're saying within our conversation, because we like to say Hispanic as though Central America and South America are all the same culture. And so it's kind of ironic that you point that out, because I feel like this is a very surface level silliness, honestly. And you're directed towards you. And the diversity that you're seeking is very interesting. And I don't find it to be necessary for there to be effective lawmaking. As a matter of fact, let me just state my case. I look at the discrepancy between the population and those in power as revealing, interesting, and something worth studying. You do something more, you probably see it the same with that, but then you go farther and say it's actually a problem. And that's what Ron's actually, I think, getting at with the purpose of the show is you're actually going further and say it's actually a problem. Not just that there's a difference between the population and the representation and that reveals there's something going on. You're actually saying it's in and of itself a problem that these white males, as a matter of fact, if you could wave your wand, you really should just take all those white males out, make it half male, half female, and then get the population numbers and get all the breakdown. And you might even take the Asian population and break them into actual groups, and then really parse it all out. And then you would need to fill the legislature with that makeup of people. Maybe you could have small group voting blocks to select within each ethnicity for that particular ethnic category. And to you, that would no longer be a problem. And that's the difference between you and I. I don't know that it's a problem that that there's white males in and of itself. I think that you'd have to find out about these people, find out if they're racist or not. They could be the least racist people. Find out if they have experiences that shape their opinions. I don't just judge people because I don't feel like I know who these people are because they're white and male. And so that's the difference between you and I. I do think the data reveals the disparity in the data between the numbers within legislature, for example, and population shows there's something going on here, because in this sort of utopian world, you would expect sort of a more uniformity. But I don't actually see a problem in and of itself unless I actually find a specific example of racism. That's why I asked you, can you think of a specific example of racism, a specific example where white males is actually causing an actual problem?
I think you like to bring up too.
Confused.
Yeah, you like to bring up too how Roe v. Wade was decided by males.
Whereas if there were some females, I really sincerely believe this. If there were 9 mothers, on that Supreme Court case, deciding on whether that was a person inside the womb, which is what they had to decide on, is an integral element of the Texas thing. The Texas was saying they were protecting the right of the person. If there was 9 mothers there who had born children, I would not be shocked if they would have ruled in the favor that that is a child. So anyhow, it's all very interesting. It's very interesting.
So it sounds like you're saying that that Roe v. Wade would have been perhaps there would have been a better outcome for the decision, or that it might have been better if those Supreme Court justices were better informed on their own experience, if there had been 9 female mothers who were on that Supreme Court as opposed to an all-male court.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that this is a flip of what I just said a second ago, and I'm only saying it not because I believe it, but I'm saying it as simply a. I'm not saying it because I believe that's what would have happened. I'm saying
No.
and I don't believe that. I'm putting it up as a
type of counterexample.
It's kind of like a counterexample. It's kind of it's the same as like she said when why don't I'll think it'll be good when there's 9 females. Not that like that has any real significance with respect to what the actual views of the people are and all these other things and like getting into the finer details, but it's simply like juxtaposing some different thought-provoking perspectives, if that makes any sense. So I actually don't.
Okay.
I don't. Does that make sense?
You don't think that they would? You don't think they would have been better informed just merely for being female? You think they would have been better informed on an individual basis, understanding them as individuals in their individual context, and that when we kind of make these broad strokes along whatever we perceive as race or ethnicity or gender, that these are so superficial that they're nonsensical, and that we should really only be considering each individual as far as positions of power and their particular context, and that we should never be aiming toward checking a box as far as being representative of the population, because that's not what's going to help us. What's going to help us is examining each individual and whether they actually hold racist views, or examining each individual and looking whether they're competent and or sensitive to the issues of their constituents, not whether they say, whether they have a uterus or not.
Yes. Beyond diversity. Go beyond diversity. But I was nominated the timekeeper, and it is past 2 hours in this conversation, which goes to show how interesting it is. But maybe if everyone could just give a final quick thought, and we might revisit this at a later time.
Yeah. So I'm going to give my final thoughts here. Is that we can definitely continue this discussion, because if we again try to define these problems, which I feel like I feel like the premise is that white people in power are hazardous, as we heard earlier, and that there's some hazard there, or potential hazard with that happening. And again, for me, my question is going to be, for the next time this discussion is, specifically, what are these hazards? As far as I've been able to determine from this conversation, the only hazard that there really is that, the white male number or dominates the rest in leadership positions. But that's the only problem we're trying to solve here, because at the end of the day, we know that if we mix those numbers up, all the real problems, all the real issues that people are complaining about and dealing with, those aren't going to go anywhere.
I fell asleep.
Oh, Jeff.
No, I'm just kidding. No, it's been fun, and I appreciate Ned coming on, and it's been interesting. I appreciate diverse opinions because it's nice to explore the thought process of others.
Awesome.
Dana? Or Ned?
Yeah, go ahead, Dana. Sure.
Yeah, well, I guess my thought is skin color shouldn't matter. And I think that my I guess ideal is just going beyond diversity, where I live, like skin color and ethnic group don't matter, as far as like in any way that I would like I wouldn't choose to dissociate from somebody based on these things, or conversely, be good friends with someone because they have the right skin color. And I just think that the future and the better way is going beyond diversity. So in my life, my personal life, I really look for like ideological unity, like where I pursue, say, like in a church setting, things like that, uniting with people based on our ideas about how, and as a country, I think our future would be in not pursuing diversity as something to be desired, but just going beyond it, like as a country pursuing things like justice, equal treatment under the law, and thinking the best of others. That would probably be a better way forward for us than checking boxes and categorizing people based on their skin color.
Awesome.
Yes, that's very good.
So I'll try to keep this short. My final thought, I guess, is that I come from actually a very conservative background, and I think that I come from a context that was actually has had an historical racist just environment that I didn't even understand, and that I, in some ways, am not particularly sold on any particular narrative as far as what's actually happening out in the world and what the actual problems are. And I hope I didn't do too bad of a job of trying to articulate and portray what maybe the more kind of left-leaning and voices might have to say about diversity. But that when I kind of compare notes, when I currently read conservative viewpoints that seem to match up with some of these ideas about diversity being very problematic and contradictory and not solving anything, versus the narratives that say diversity is important and these are the reasons why, and there are still real problems that are being ignored, and here are the studies and the stats to back it up. I tend to find the latter narrative more compelling. I tend to find currently that when I listen to the voices that are saying diversity should be a value, and these are the reasons why, and it should be a concern, and here are the current issues that it's trying to address, I do find that extremely compelling. And so hopefully I didn't do too bad of a job of articulating it. I think it would actually be helpful if we were to continue on this topic at all to more carefully define some of the different categories of diversity and how we even think of it. I meant to create a survey that I was going to send to each of you prior to tonight, but of course life got in the way. So I don't know if we're going to continue on this topic again or if we'll do this again. But I might send you an email or two with possibly a survey, possibly a few articles or something that you may or may not find interesting.
Well, no, please do, for the sake of the conversation, because personally I wouldn't mind continuing it. So yes, please do send the articles so we can read through them.
Great.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Jeff.
Yes, thank you, Ned, for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
That was
Thank you
great.
for. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right,
And,
senors. That's a wrap of the infamous DJ Ron show.
Awesome.